may have noticed a contrast between the Isaiah reading and the Psalm reading. One sounded very cheerful, and the other sounded not so cheerful. We had the bounty of the earth and some sort of terrible fate awaiting the Israelites in Isaiah, and that's because somewhere in the transmission of what the texts were going to be for today, a 5 got left off the documentation, so we were in the wrong chapter of Isaiah, and it's a significant contrast because the beginning of Isaiah is the preparation for Isaiah to say to the Israelites, God is just finished with you and is going to let you be carried off to Babylon, where you're going to live for I don't know how long to make up for what rotten people you are. And by the time you get to chapter 55, God has brought the people back to Jerusalem, and everything's pretty jolly by comparison. So here we are in chapter 55 with the same verses, 10 through 13. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there until they have watered the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall be to the Lord for a memorial, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. And now we move to the gospel lesson for today, which is in Matthew chapter 13, and you'll see why all that stuff about sowing seeds and things sprouting and growing has a relationship to the gospel lesson for today. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Now, this is a two-part reading, and the disciples didn't quite get what Jesus meant, so here's the explanation that is added later. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. Will you pray with me? Compassionate Creator, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and minds be acceptable in your sight, you who are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. A lot of you know that I moved here about a year and a half ago, and I frequently think back to my 25 years in Maine. In my old neighborhood in Maine, there were many mature hydrangeas, the ones that grow into an umbrella shape and produce beautiful, creamy pink blossoms that are almost as beautiful when they are dried, brown, and rose. I really wanted one of those hydrangeas. I probably mentioned this to anyone who would listen. I'm not really sure what stopped me from going to the nursery and buying one, but eventually someone else did, and I got one as a present in 2002, just before I was ordained. We planted it beside the back steps of our house where I could see it from the kitchen window. I eagerly anticipated bringing the blossoms inside to enjoy. A sower went out to sow. Here begins a long string of parables that make up chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel. In them, Jesus takes familiar topics for the community and turns them into stories about God's kingdom and our place in it. We may find them obscure, and it's tempting to think the people around him who knew the context, who lived it, would have understood him perfectly, but we see him having to explain what he meant to the disciples, recognizing things weren't quite as easily understood as he perhaps hoped they would be. In the parables, Jesus employed metaphors. Now, they are not allegories in which each character would represent an absolute and definable other, for instance, God, or Jesus himself, or the listeners, or the readers. That would be too easy. These parables may be interpreted in a multitude of ways and are intended to convey an idea to consider rather than an answer to implement. As an English major who enjoys metaphor and tries to employ it herself, I appreciate the parables. But as a follower of Jesus who wants to get it right, I sometimes find them frustrating. The parable of the sower, because of its complexity, may be one of the worst offenders. Is God the sower, flinging Jesus into our sometimes rocky hearts? Are we the sowers, called to share the good news with others who will only listen about a quarter of the time? And wherever we find ourselves in the story, are we fated, doomed to remain in that role? That's the hardest question of all. The sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path. My last church in Maine was in a suburb of Portland with a long rural history, attractive to city dwellers who wanted access to culture and restaurants, but also enough space to stretch out and grow some things. One time I stopped in to see an older gentleman who had just come home from the hospital, a retired executive who had come up to Maine to have his plot of land. He and his wife talked not only about his recovery from a strange bacterial illness picked up on a hiking trip in the Southwest, but also about their garden. Mrs. Gary told me about the Italian zucchini seeds they saved and parceled out to plant over the years, still germinating and producing the modest harvest they desired. Mr. Gary asked if I had planted a garden, and I started to make some excuse about the shaded city lot on which I lived. His wife kindly pointed out to him that given my busy schedule, I probably didn't want to have to tend a garden myself. And while there's some truth to all of that, the shade and the busy schedule, the greater truth is that I am a famous plant killer. Which is one of the reasons that when I had that yard in Portland for the last 14 years I lived there, I planted only things that I considered to be Martha-proof. These included indestructible shrubs such as forsythia and lilacs. But every now and then I take a chance on something more daring, and one year I planted one of those more bush-like hydrangeas with the sort of purpley blue flowers. You'll have to forgive my lack of technical terms. And that hydrangea, oh, it failed. It's one of the reasons I was extra happy about the other kind of hydrangea so lovingly planted by the back steps. It was more like a tree, and surely nothing I did could really screw it up, right? A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil, and they brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. We all know some ground is better than other ground, even a confirmed city girl like me. We probably all know that some people are better ground than other ground too. We trust them to be the way we think they are. We put them into categories. This one I can trust, this one is wise, this one is loving, but maybe not so smart. This one is smart, but maybe not so nice. The parable encourages us to do that kind of categorizing. Some people will never get it. Oh, that is so easy and clean and tempting to believe. Isn't that what the last section of the reading says? But wait. A parable is not an allegory. The roles are not so easily defined. And scholars suggest that this parable is absolutely not an allegory so easily explained, that the explanation of the parable, which is also found in Mark's gospel, was an editorial addition because people so desperately want clear answers. So imagine the story is passed down, and the people who hear it are frustrated, and finally someone who's putting it on papyrus, scroll, paper, writes an explanation and puts it in the mouth of Jesus. Jesus gives us metaphors, with more of them to come. That little hydrangea in my backyard grew as you might have expected, and in its second spring, its roots gave off a scent that attracted the attention of our young dog, who enjoyed scrabbling at them frantically, trying to get to that delicious new smell. I imagine that wasn't very good for the hydrangea. Nor were the winters that froze it in a bent-over position, and even though we staked it, and despite the fact that it had a number of years of abundant blossoming, and received, I hope, appropriate pruning, although maybe not, there came a year when it did nothing. After a not-so-bad winter, the seemingly uncompromised hydrangea, age 7.5, simply did not put forth leaves or buds. I stood beside it, downhearted, wondering what I could have done differently. How could I have saved it? As that year wore on, other things came to a halt in my life, and friends came from all over the country to stand beside me. And you know how it is when people want to help us, but they can't actually solve the real problem? So they started doing tasks around my house, like raking the leaves and painting things that looked shabby and mowing the lawn, trying to fix the ice maker, filling the freezer with lasagna portioned out into two-person-sized containers for my daughter and me. In the midst of a flurry of yard work, my friend Catherine offered to clear out the dead tree. I agreed it was a good idea, and I turned away to consider a lilac that needed pruning, probably not by me, then turned back to see if it was already out of the ground, to see it was already out of the ground like an oversized twig in her hand. Whatever happened to my hydrangea had happened at the root. Truly, I tell you, it is not wise to assign roles in the parable of the hydrangea. It's enough to say that it reinforced my sense that a phase of my life was over. The next spring, in the place near my back door where it once stood, violets from the general vicinity spread themselves. Instead of a dead and disappointing oversized stick, there were shiny green leaves and lovely purple flowers. My story was not over. God was still working in my life, and even after the hydrangea, there was more to come. Now I've put down new roots here, and Catherine is more than my friend. Isaiah promises us, instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress. Instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall be to the Lord a memorial for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. Instead of the hydrangea came up the violets. And that brings me back to our sower and his seeds. What if we just let the images wash over us instead of being in a hurry to assign parts to ourselves and to others as if they were absolutely unchangeable? Suppose we meditate for a moment on the idea that the good news of God's love is forever being sown in the world, scattered widely without regard for likely climates or soils, strewn wildly even in the places it is least likely to be received. A sower went out to sow, and on any given day, the least likely place might be any of our hearts. But now and then, thankfully, we are the soil where God's seed takes root. Now and then, thankfully, we are the seed that makes contact and grows where someone is hungry for God's grace. Even occasionally, we are the ones to put a hand into the bag slung over our shoulders, the ones who fling the seed of life and love into places where they most assuredly put down roots. Thanks be to God. Amen.